He was the superintendent at Kenwood Country Club, where in 1964 they held the U.S. Women's Open. They also kept a real nice yard, grew vegetables and a lot of flowers at their house too. I think the most impressed I was with him was when I was a junior at Mizzou. He was on campus for a turfgrass conference. I met him there, and while talking with him and a K-State professor, this professor told me that my granddad knew about as much about turfgrass as anybody there at the university. And we all know what good program K-State has now. Granddad did pretty good for a guy who was just an old Kansas farm boy who came to the city. It's a great honor, and thank you on Chet's behalf.
Okay, and last but certainly not least, Don Keene will induct Marion Burns Horn Tyson.
My fellow board members and distinguished honorees and guests, it's been a great pleasure and a privilege to be part of the ad hoc committee to establish the initial Kansas City Golf Hall of Fame. I also want to thank all the members of the committee for all the work that they did and all the efforts that were put into this project. My name's Jimmy. I'm a caddy. Well, maybe not so much anymore because, well, you know, there's not much caddy business going around anymore. But once you've been a caddy as long as I have, I reckon you always think of yourself as being a caddy. A lot of you folks know my story. I've been looping around here longer than I care to remember. Started back when my old man was driving an ice wagon. He and my brother Bobby delivered them big old chunks of ice around. I seen good times and I seen bad times. I seen the great ones and some not so great. And I know a little something about all these people you've been talking about here today. Yeah, I remember young Tommy. He won his first match play championship. What'd you say it was, 1964? A lot of folks back then thought he was going to be pretty good. Going to be something special. But heck, he wasn't no more than 15 years old at the time. Old Jimmy wasn't so sure about that, but I guess the little Huckleberry turned out to be all right after all. Yeah, I seen Tommy and Mr. Duke and Mr. Thirsk over there and Mrs. Hill. I even knew Mr. Mendenhall a little bit because sometimes, like when my mama was sick and I had to earn a little extra money, I'd go over and rake bunkers and stuff over there at Mission. That man could really grow some grass, you're right. And I remember when Mr. Reed took over from Mr. Lamberth as head of the KCGA. I reckon I could tell you stories about all these folks if we had a little more time. But I'm here because I'm supposed to tell you about my special loop, Miss Miriam. Yeah, old Jimmy carried a lot of bags around a lot of golf courses in these parts. But you know, I got to say, I kind of specialized in looping for the ladies. And there wasn't no woman or girl around here that I liked looping for better than that Miss Miriam Burns. We was both at Milburn, you know. I went there after they closed the old Evanston Club out by Swope Park. She took lessons from our head pro, Mr. Harry Robb. Let me show you something. You probably can't even see it. See what that says right there? I'll help you. It says Harry Robb Special. Yeah, I got this club from Mr. Harry himself back in, I think it was in the late 20s when they was switching over to to steel shafts. Some of you folks think you need a club head as big as a dinner plate and all kinds of graphite and fancy stuff. I'll tell you what, you try hitting balls with a niblick with a shaft that goes like that. Then you see how hard the game is. Mr. Harry, he was from Scotland, you know, and he kind of talked a little funny, but he learned to make clubs and such when he was an apprentice, even before he came over here. Oh yeah, Miss Miriam. Jimmy, I was little Jimmy back then. I first seen her when I was shagging balls for Mr. Harry one day when he was giving this pretty young thing a lesson. The kid could make 2 bits sometimes chasing down them practice balls. Anyhow, she had a swing as easy as a leaf falling off a tree. A little unorthodox maybe, bent over a little more at the waist than some of the others, but it sure looked good to me, and it sure worked good for her. She hit that old Dunlop, she always played Dunlop ball. You ever seen those ones with the square mesh kind of dimples on them? That's what she played all the time. And she hit that ball about as far as anybody her size I ever seen. But the real strength of her game was in her putting. I reckon we had about the best greens in town back in the 20s. Not like what you got today, of course. I mean, nothing like what you got today, but she spent hours working on that short game. Some say she learned to putt good from Walter Hagen. But I ain't so sure about that. I'll tell you what, our Mr. Harry was pretty good at getting that old pellet into the hole himself. She and me, we won our first tournament when she was just 16 years old. You know, we traveled to a lot of courses around here, and we won a lot of tournaments together, me and Miss Miriam. Lots of times, we went up against Miss Opal Hill. Y'all heard about Mrs. Hill a little bit ago. Now, she was quite a bit older than my Miss Miriam, but boy, could she play. Anyways, the biggest thing Miss Miriam did was she won the United States Women's Amateur in 1927. She was just 23 years old at the time. And you know, this was back in what folks call the roaring 20s. And Miss Miriam, she was quite a hit with the galleries. Pretty. Wore them fancy clothes. But more than anything, she could flat out play golf. I heard that one sports writer called her Queen Accuracy because she hardly never missed a putt that she should make. I'll tell you what, when she brought that big old Cox Trophy back to Kansas City, the KCGA and the Women's Golf Association, they threw her a big shindig down by Union Station. And then later that night, they had a big to-do over at Milburn. There was flappers and men in their fancy suits, and they had a big band from down on the Vine. Benny Moten, I think it was. Played music all night long. Oh, Jimmy, I stayed around and kind of peeped in the windows just to see what them rich folks was doing. It was quite a party. Never seen anything like it before or since. I guess 1927 was probably her best year. I mean, how you top winning the National Amateur? But she won a bunch of other stuff, too. She won the city match play 7 times. She won the state twice when she was just 18 and 19 years old. Me and Miss Miriam, we took the very first Trans-Mississippi when they played it over at Blue Hill, the real Blue Hills, you know, the one at 63rd Street. That was in 1927, and guess who we beat? Ms. Hill. Beat her in the finals. But I have to tell you, Miss Hill got her back the next year up in Minnesota when she beat Miss Miriam in the final. Maybe that was because Jimmy couldn't travel with her. Just wouldn't look right, a young ruffian like me traveling with a pretty young thing like that for a golf tournament. Anyway, she won her last big national event in 1930 when she won the Women's Western Amateur for the second time. Then she retired from the game, same year as Bobby Jones. She was remarried by then, and her and Mr. Tyson traveled the world seeing sights and such. You know, old Jimmy could never quite get used to hearing folks calling her Mrs. George Tyson. She'd always be just Miss Miriam to me. Yeah, there wasn't none better than my Miss Miriam. That's why the Kansas City Golf Association is proud to include Miriam Burns Horn Tyson in the inaugural class of the Kansas City Golf Hall of Fame. I'd like to ask Mr. Eric Packel, the president of the Milburn Golf and Country Club, to come forward and accept her plaque.
Well, thank you very much. This is a really neat event. I really didn't know what I was getting into when I got up this morning. And it's not easy to follow the likes of Stan Thirsk and Bob Reed and Tom Watson, and now I got Jimmy the caddy talking about me. I really did not know what was going to happen today when I woke up. But quickly, I'll say this. As everybody knows, over the last, well, for a couple of years recently, we had a real trying time at our club. And after the fire, we looked inside and really were introspective. And I've got to mention Greg Dunn. He gets embarrassed every time I do. But under his great leadership, we persevered. But one of the things that happened over the last couple of years is, in looking inside, our history kind of percolated and kind of came up to the top. And I think the members learned a lot about the history of Milburn. And when you think of the history of Milburn, two people always come up. It's Harry Robb and Miriam Burns. And so this is really a great honor for us. After we redid our clubhouse, we named the ladies' lounge the Miriam Burns Lounge. So her lounge is 4 months old, or 5 months old now, and it'll be great to hang this inside of her lounge. So thank you very much.
This concludes this year's ceremony. Next year, of course, we'll have another class, so we'll have an election coming up in probably May, I guess, something like that. So we'll be doing the nomination process and bringing in more members to the Hall of Fame next year, and then it'll be on every other year after next year. So thank you very much for attending.